What's up, everybody? It's your man, MG Marcus Grant. And are you looking to stay up to date with the latest goings-on of your favorite, or maybe not so favorite NFL team? Well, how do you do that? You go directly to the source. Every week, Matty Kroll is doing just that with On the Beat, talking to beat reporters from across the National Football League. Be sure to check it out each and every week on 32-Bit.
Yo, what is going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of On Beat featuring the Seahawks. This is your boy, this is your host, Calvin Domingo, a.k.a. Steezy A. Smith. And you guys probably already know my saying by now, but today I got a very important guest with me. And as you guys might or might not know, I'm one who covers the Seahawks myself. So today it is my pleasure, it is an honor to welcome Mr. Corbin Smith of the Sports Illustrated's Seahawks Mevin.
Thanks for having me.
How you doing today, Corbin? Good morning.
I'm great. It's draft season, Hayes in the barn for the most part. Still got a few draft profiles to kick out, but got a chance to watch a lot of the prospects and a little bit more at stake this year than there has been in recent off seasons heading into the draft. So,
oh, no doubt. I mean, we're talking about the first top 10 pick in Seahawks history since 2010. So we're talking about more than a decade since, the Seahawks have picked in the top 10. I actually read your last article on Seahawks Mevin. You were talking about Charles Cross and how he could be a potential fit replacement for Duane Brown. Before we get into the thick of things, just because we are on that topic, is Duane Brown coming back to Seattle?
At this point, I would say that it's probably a 50-50 proposition, but a lot of it is riding on what happens in the draft. If they pick a tackle at number 9 overall and they pick another one in the middle of the draft to go with Jake Curhan and Stone Forsythe, then I could see Seattle saying, you know what, we're going young. Maybe they would sign another veteran. But if they don't pick 2 tackles, they don't pick one early, then I absolutely think that it's potentially there that they could bring back Brown. The issue they're going to be dealing with, they're going to have to create a little bit of cap space. They don't have very much to work with right now. So that one is really up in the air at this point until the draft commences.
Okay, that's totally understandable. Well, before we get to know more about the Seahawks, I want to get to know more about you. So, like you talked about off air, before becoming a full-time sports reporter in 2017, where you got your start with the USA Today Seahawks Wire, you were an AP Economics high school teacher, and you were also a high school football coach. And like you also talked about, you covered the Seahawks as a hobby. You had your own NFL website. So I got to ask, at what point did you realize you wanted to cover the Seahawks or sports full time, and did it hurt leaving behind your job as a high school teacher and a high school football coach?
I still have moments where I really miss coaching. I can't necessarily say that I miss teaching, and not because I didn't like teaching young people. It was the other things that go with it, working with administrators and, the extra hours grading over the weekend and stuff like that. Those are the things that I don't necessarily miss. I loved working with the kids. But this was actually kind of a job that just happened because I thought it was always just going to be, I'm going to write a few times a week just because I really enjoy it. And I'm going to teach, I'm going to coach. Eventually I'll be a head coach for a high school program. That was my goal. And then the school I was teaching it out here, I found out in the middle of lunch during the month of April that they weren't going to be bringing me back because they had a small freshman class coming in. And I was the last teacher they hired in the social studies department. So that's how they made that choice, who wasn't going to be back. And I was really upset about it for about a month. I mean, it really was a struggle for me because it was my first year there. I'd moved from Indiana out to Washington. So I thought I was going to be at that school for a long time. And then coming to the realization I wasn't going to be, I had an offer to teach at another school in the area about 2 weeks after the school year ended. So, I got a great opportunity here. And I just decided the day after they offered me the job not to take it. I decided I'm going to try to get into sports writing for a career and see if it works out. And so I went into it not knowing what was going to happen, whether it was going to work out or not. And here we are now 5 years later and fully credentialed reporter. I can't complain too much about how things have played out.
And one of the best in the game, right? One of the voices of the Seattle Seahawks. And so I can't, I'm just amazed, what you've been able to do. I got to ask though, so you graduated from Manchester College, right? With a Bachelor of Science degree in secondary education. Did you go back to school to take any journalism classes?
I did not. I don't have a single journalism class. Now, I will say this, the school that I attended was a liberal arts college. So I took 3 or 4 really high-level writing courses. And I also as a history major, I had to do a lot of long reports on various historical topics. So I had a lot of experience writing. But as far as reporting went, I had absolutely no experience going into this process. I did some podcasting at it, but otherwise, prior to 2012 and when I graduated from college, I had no experience in this field whatsoever. I had played sports, but I had never covered them before. So, I never went back to school for journalism degrees or, even just getting some classes under my belt. I have fully gone into this with my educational background.
And all the more respect to you, which is what I was kind of talking about. But just by chance, is that NFL website that you launched still up?
It's not. We had the Legion of 12.com where we posted articles, and that's been down for 5 or 6 years. I saved some of the articles and put them into a file on my computer so I could always have them kind of as a, keepsake to look back at how far things have come. But no, I keep that in my folder with all my old stand-up comedy and heavy metal songs and stuff. I mean, I've done a lot of different things over the years leading up to this, trying to get into different industries. And I can't say the other two worked out, but this one seems to have.
Well, I saw on your Twitter bio, it says that you're a retired comedian. Is that something you still do from time to time?
I at this point, very rarely. COVID kind of impacted this. Obviously, COVID, you couldn't do stand-up comedy shows. And now that those have come back, I haven't done any open mic nights for a long time. But kind of in the back of my mind and wondered this summer if maybe I want to get a few of those in. But there's a reason I'm not doing it anymore because it wasn't going to be a career for me. People enjoy when I mix in voices occasionally, if Arnold Schwarzenegger comes on your show or whatever. But as far as stand-up comedy goes, I've kind of delved away from that. And I try to not mix that too much with my writing career. I have a few players that I've done voices with that I have good relationships with, but generally I try to stay professional. And if somebody requests, I'll do a voice. But for the most part, I've kind of put that on the back burners because I had some success. I auditioned for America's Got Talent, got to the second round, but it's not something that I just came to a realization it wasn't going to be a career for me. So, and doing comedy in front of 150 people is way harder to do than, doing a one-on-one interview with a player or coach. You want to talk about a stress cooker. That is a different level of stress.
But just because it isn't a career doesn't mean it can't remain a hobby. So it doesn't mean that you gotta.
Like I said, I might still do a few open mic nights occasionally, just because those were fun when it was you're the main show and people are expecting you to be funny. Like that's a lot of pressure. It really is.
Really is. So I feel for people like Kevin Hart. I mean, my gosh, him coming up there time and time again to where he's at now. I mean, a whole bunch of respect. Before we dive into the Seahawks, I got one more personal question for you, Mr. Corbin Smith. So like you, I also started covering the Seahawks a couple of years ago as a hobby. I actually started doing it on YouTube. And 2 years later, it's become something of a part-time job now, I would say. So what's your biggest piece of advice for someone who's turned a hobby into a career?
I think just exactly what you're doing. I think you've got to find something that you're passionate about, that you want to put the time into. I mean, that's the big thing. You've got to find a way to have work-life balance, because that was my biggest problem early on when I was starting to dive into sports writing. Like I would be working on articles or coming up with interviews, sending out flyers to people. I'd be doing that from 7 a.m. till like 8 or 9 at night. You mixed in podcasts and stuff. And so it got to a point where it's like, that's the kind of work you got to put in to really get where you want to be. But I eventually reached a point where it's like, I got to find a little more work-life balance too. So obviously the effort that you put in, it needs to be something that you're passionate about, something that you really care about, that doesn't necessarily feel like a job. And a lot of people aren't lucky enough to have a job like that. And so I feel blessed that I've been able to land in a position. When I was teaching, the rewards of teaching made me feel that way a lot of the time as well. I really enjoyed working with kids and stuff, but covering a professional sport team for a living. Yeah, to get where you want to go, you got to find something you're passionate about. You've got to put the work in, and you got to be willing to make connections. And that might have been the hardest part for me because, and I've been very open about this on our podcast on Locked On Seahawks. I've been very open with this on social media. I mean, I've got pretty bad social anxiety disorder, and I have since I was a little kid. If you would have told me in high school that I was going to be a reporter that was interviewing players and coaches, I would have laughed at you. There's no way. I mean, I used to go into I used to have struggles going into a pizza place to pick up a pizza. That's how bad my social anxiety was. And so for me to be where I'm at now, doing a job like this, I mean, again, you would have told me 10 years ago I was doing this. I'm like, you're crazy, because I didn't have that ability to communicate with people or interest in communicating with people like that. And so, yeah, you got to find that thing that you're passionate about. Mm-hmm. You got to put the work in. And I think if you do those two things and you make connections and you take advantage of those connections, you can get where you want to go. There is no limit.
1,000%. Wow. I mean, I watch all your interviews. I read all your articles. I never would have known that you would had, a social anxiety disorder. Like that's so random to me. But
people that know me don't believe it, because when I know people, I talk their ears off. It's when people I don't know, and I don't know. I mean, I don't personally know a lot of the players and coaches, especially the new ones when they come in. So that, I'll admit that's the toughest part of the job for me is interviewing players, just because there's always nerves with it. But I've really, over the last few years, it's something that I have really worked and grinded at. And now I can say I'm a lot more comfortable with it. But again, that's, I guess that's my other advice. Be willing to try things. Be willing to get outside of your comfort zone, because this would have been outside of my comfort zone. It was outside of my comfort zone before I dove into this for a full-time career.
Wow. Okay. You kind of alluded to this, but you mentioned Noah Fant and Shelby Harris. To the fans out there that don't or aren't aware of these two players, what do you think they'll bring to the table moving forward? And from a statistical standpoint, what do you expect?
So Fant is a guy that I think can be an 800 to 900 yard receiving tight end. He's got that kind of ability. He ran around the 4.5 range in his 40-yard dash coming out of Iowa. Not a great blocking tight end, but this is kind of a misconception for people in Shane Waldron's offense. If you look what the Rams do, they had Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee for several years. Gerald Everett is that move tight end that you're not going to put in inline blocking situations often, but he can create havoc with matchup problems. And I think Noah Fant is that kind of player with arguably more athleticism and a little bit more size, and maybe more upside as a blocker. He has improved the last couple of years. It's not a strength in his game, but he's a guy that you can see on film has the ability to stretch teams vertically down the seam. He can break tackles, create after the catch. He does a lot of the things the Seahawks wanted Gerald Everett to do, but he's a couple years younger. He has been more productive than Everett ever has been in the NFL. 2 straight years, almost 700 receiving yards, as especially impressive given the offensive situation the Broncos had with their quarterbacks. So that's really the issue there. Who's playing quarterback for the Seahawks? If it's Drew Lock, can those two with their chemistry continue their ascendance together? If it's Baker Mayfield, if it's a rookie quarterback, I mean, how does that impact Fant? So it's tough to project production with the uncertainty they've got a quarterback. As for Shelby Harris, he's been good for 6 sacks a year, I believe 3 of the last 5 seasons. He's had a couple years where he hasn't been quite as productive, but he is going to be disruptive as an interior rusher. He's going to collapse the pocket. He's a sound run defender. He's going to be able to play all over the defensive line. He can play defensive end. He can play nose. He can play that 3-tech, 4-eye technique in a 3-4 scheme. So again, perfect for that scheme because of that versatility and his athleticism, the ability to do a number of different things. So he might, in the immediate future, he might be the best veteran they brought in, at least for 2022, because I think he starts for him, and he's a guy that can really help with their pass rush from the interior.
No doubt about that. He's actually another player that I'm very, very excited about, and I think people are sleeping on Shelby Harris. You also brought up a Baker Mayfield. So I also spoke with, you probably know him, but former Seahawks wide receiver Michael Bumpus about a month ago, and I asked him about the likelihood of a Baker Mayfield landing in Seattle. he talked about how because Baker Mayfield is going to be 27 when the season starts, that kind of indicates more of a win now move. And I know Baker Mayfield has led Cleveland to a playoff victory, but that roster was absolutely loaded, was very talented. And Seattle, I can't really say the same. And so what do you think is the likelihood that a Baker Mayfield lands in Seattle if the Cleveland Browns were to attach either draft capital or take on a significant portion of his $18.5 million salary?
Well, that's the only way it's going to happen. I don't think there's a team out there that's going to take the $18.5 million guaranteed salary on Mayfield's contract. In fact, I wrote an article about this past weekend. If I'm John Schneider, I'm calling up the Browns and saying, look, let's do a Brock Osweiler type trade here. Mm-hmm. You guys attach a 6th round pick to go with Mayfield. We'll pay $3 or $4 million of that. If you release him, you're going to have to pay almost all of that, most likely, because no team is going to turn around and sign him for more than the veteran minimum. There would be no reason to. He's going to get his $18.5 million. But I would make the argument to the Browns, if they scoff at that idea, be like, okay, well, you guys can release him, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers can sign him, and you can play him twice a year in the AFC North, because Baker Mayfield would want to do that. If the Steelers were interested, the chance to beat his former team twice, he's got a chronic chip on his shoulder. So that would be the offer that I would make. If you can't get him for anything less than that, then I'm not doing it. If he gets released, then maybe you make a play. A lot of that rides on what they decide to do in the draft. If they draft a quarterback, I can't see him going out and adding Mayfield when they already have Drew Lock and now re-sign Geno Smith. So they don't pick a quarterback, then that keeps them in the discussion if Mayfield is still available. But right now, I'd be leaning towards them not being a favorite there. I actually think the Panthers would make more sense, and they might be more desperate at this point to make a move to bring him in. Wouldn't rule the Seahawks out, but they're not going to do it without it being on the cheap.
100%. I feel like with the Seahawks, I mean, that'd be a win now move. Like I just mentioned, and right now, I just don't think, in my estimation, I don't think Seattle's roster is built to win now. I think Carolina would be a better fit just so they wouldn't have to reach for a quarterback 6 overall. But lately, and actually all offseason, wide receivers have dominated headlines. And I think you know where this is going. Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, AJ Brown, Terry McLaurin. Some of these guys have signed contracts. Some of these guys haven't. So now that brings us to DK Metcalf. A lot of people have kind of talked about how, Seattle's going to be a run-first team. Why pay a wide receiver $20-25+ million? Others have pointed out, if Drew Lock is going to be the guy, or Seattle brings in a rookie quarterback, wouldn't you want to surround him with a top-tier weapon like a DK Metcalf? Do you have any sort of insight as to when, or is DK going to be extended this year? Is it going to be next year? Is he going to be traded? What are your thoughts on the entire situation?
I don't see him getting traded. And I know that there have been some fans out there, they've seen, I've done some deep dives into some potential trade options that they could have, but I just don't see that this is a deal that's going to come to fruition. This is a much different situation than Russell Wilson or Bobby Wagner. Bobby Wagner was going to be 32 and has shown some signs, even though he's still a very good player, has shown signs of decline in the field. Russell Wilson, for several years, has been expressing displeasure with the way things are going in Seattle. It reached a point where this is when we can get our maximum return. So let's move him right now. If they would have waited till next year, they're not going to get the draft picks back that they did, as many of them, back from the Broncos or whoever the suitor is. So now is the time to do it. DK Metcalf, though, is 24 years old. He's already been an all-pro. He's still improving. He's got a chance to be one of the best receivers in the NFL. He's one of only 7 guys in NFL history to post more than 2,900 receiving yards, 29 receiving touchdowns, and a certain number of receptions. He's in this elite group with Jerry Rice and Odell Beckham Jr. in that group, but he is one of the best receivers in his first 3 years in NFL history. He wants to be here. He's publicly stated that. He wants to step into a leadership role now. You don't trade a player like that. You re-sign him. I think it happens in that window right before training camp that we've seen a lot of contracts get signed. I think Metcalf gets his multi-year extension signed in late July would be my projection. I don't see him getting traded. There might still be some teams calling and inquiring, and the Seahawks have to pick up the phone. You always listen. But I just can't see them moving on from a player that should be one of their foundational pieces. And you're going to have money to pay him because Russell Wilson's contract's off the books after this year.
100%. I mean, last time I looked at some of the contracts under the books, there's only 2 guys making north of $10 million as far as the cap hit. And so it's like, who else do you got to pay in Seattle, right? I want to pivot towards the draft now, though. And I know we talked about at the top of the show in your latest article, you talked about Charles Cross. Well, a lot of fans have been clamoring for a Sauce Gardner or a Derek Stingley or Evan Neal, Ike Okongwu. Do you have any sort of insight as to what position group Seattle is going to be looking to target at 9th overall? And is there a possibility that they potentially trade down?
Well, the trade down possibility is definitely there, especially if they have a couple guys they really like that are there at number 9. And the big thing here is, how do the quarterbacks fall? Because that is really what is going to dictate what this first round looks like. Like last year, there was talk about 5 quarterbacks going to the top 10. They ended up going top 15. So that was a loaded quarterback class. This year, not so much. At least the public perception is that this is not near as good of a class. But if there are a few teams that trade up trying to get quarterbacks, or there's teams like the Saints that want to get in the top 10 to get their QB of the future, and the Seahawks don't have a guy they want to pick for a quarterback there, then yeah, you try to negotiate to get their 2 first-round picks and get those selections. I mean, the Eagles have 2 first rounders. There are a lot of possibilities behind him if John Schneider wants to play that game. It's really going to boil down to quarterbacks and tackles trading up to get those 2 position groups. How does that quarterback group fall? Do the Seahawks have a QB they love? For all we know, they could try to trade up for Malik Willis. I mean, there's a lot of different dominoes that could fall here. And we know the Seahawks are as unpredictable as any team in the NFL when it comes to the draft. And so I'd love to tell you that I have insight on what they're going to be picking, but they do an incredible job of tight sealing that information. I can tell you the players that I think would be good fits based on past precedent, the guys they've had visits with. But as far as what they're going to do there, if I had to make a prediction, I think tackle is probably the position they're hoping they can get a guy, but they're not going to reach either, which would open the door for that trade down possibility.
1,000%. I mean, like we've seen time and time again, Rashad Penny, Jordan Brooks. I know Jordan Brooks is kind of panned out, but these selections in the first round have always been outside of the box, right? Even a Bruce Irvin way back in 2012, I think everyone was caught off guard. A few more questions here before we go. I wanted to ask, so a few players have returned to Seattle: Justin Coleman, Quentin Jefferson, amongst a horde of other free agent signings. Uchenna Nwosu comes to mind. What would you grade Seattle's offseason?
Right now, I can't give a full grade because we don't have the draft. Once we have that, we can really put things in perspective. But in terms of free agency, I would give them a B- right now. B-. Because the one big glaring hole that they have not addressed is the tackle position. You've got 3 tackles with a combined 5 career NFL starts. Now, I was pleased with what Jay Curhan did last year, the end of the year. Maybe he's your guy. They like Stone Forsythe. Maybe he's your left tackle of the future. But not having a veteran to compete against them, they're going to have to add to that group. So that's something I'm surprised they haven't made any moves. But I loved bringing back Rashad Penny at the price they did with incentives. Quandre Diggs was a must-have in terms of bringing him back. The Will Dissly contract is probably the one that drags this down some. And I like Will Dissly. It's just 3 years for $24 million for a guy that hasn't been very productive as a receiver, and being top 15 tight end money. That's a pretty expensive contract for him. And not being able to bring back DJ Reed is probably the one big loss that really hurts too. But, Sidney Jones played well when he played last year. There's some confidence there. Artie Burns had some really good film in Chicago last year, teaming back up with Sean Desai. That could end up being a really nice signing for them. Nwosu had 40 pressures last year, is only 25. That was maybe the most encouraging signing to me, because they've always signed older players. Going out and getting a guy in his mid-20s that's in his prime, just coming into his prime and giving him a multi-year contract. The Bengals did that with a few guys last year, and we saw the results. So it's nice to see them switch things up a little bit in terms of what they're doing in free agency. There's just a few contracts that I am scratching my head a little bit about just in terms of value, but I think it's been better than a lot of fans realize. Not great. If they have a really good draft, then this offseason is going to look a lot better. Oh,
1,000%. And the one thing that surprised me about Nwosu, if I'm not mistaken, that was actually the most amount of money Seattle's given out on an average annual basis in their entire history together. John Schneider and Pete Carroll was a little bit more than what they gave to Ezekiel Ansah a couple years back. But do you have time for just 2 more quick questions?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So I got to ask, with the state of the NFC in flux, obviously outside of the Rams, outside of the Niners, and maybe the Packers and the Saints, obviously we still have to see how the draft plays out, but do you see Seattle being a sneaky, feisty team that could potentially make a run in the playoffs or at the playoffs, given the state of the NFC?
The NFC has lost so many good players that I would not rule it out. And here's the thing. I agree with you that Seattle does not have a win now roster. Right. When you trade Russell Wilson, you lose Bobby Wagner. You absolutely don't. But you still got Quandre Diggs. You got Jamal Adams. You got two of the best receivers in football. You got a tight end that I really like. Their interior offensive line, Austin Blythe might be a nice pickup for them. Damian Lewis still has a lot of upside. You've got a couple really good running backs, so you can keep them healthy. Defense, you've got Darrell Taylor, who I think is ready to break out. I mean, there are some really intriguing players on both sides of the ball. This does not feel like this is a tear down of the studs rebuild. They've got some studs on both sides of the ball. So if they can get competent quarterback play and they can get a few rookies early that can come in and contribute immediately, then this team can be a sneaky team in the NFC, especially with Pete Carroll on the sidelines. I mean, he likes coaching youth movements like this. So I could see it happening. I'm not going to sit here and predict it right now, though, because that quarterback position is the biggest issue. And if they don't have tackles to protect whoever the quarterback is, that's another problem. There are some glaring holes that must be addressed in the draft or in free agency after the draft. They've got to figure those out. But if they can get those two spots resolved, I think there's enough talent at the other positions and with the coaches they've got that this could be a team that, you know, is much more competitive than people realize. I don't know they're going to be in the playoff hunt deep in the season, but they could surprise people who are thinking this might be a 3 or 4 win team. If they don't get good quarterback play, then this could be a season that looks like the 1990s, which old Seahawks fans will tell you that was not a fun time for fans.
And ironically, I mean, the Seahawks could very well be the Denver Broncos next year, a team that's pretty much loaded everywhere outside of the quarterback position. And as of right now, the tackle spots, like we just talked about. But enough about the Seahawks. One more question about you, and then we'll wrap things up. So I got to ask, earlier you talked about interview, but enough about the Seahawks. One more question about you, and then we'll wrap things up. So I got to ask, earlier you talked about interviews and how from time to time you don't have any more nerves anymore, right? When you interview players.
Oh, I get nervous before every interview that I have. But I've learned how to cope with that, I guess is the best way to put it. And I hid this for a long time, but I just reached a point where it's like, what have I got to lose telling people? We all have warts. Everybody's got things that, you know, that make them uncomfortable. And for me, it was talking to people one-on-one that I didn't know. And so, you know, this career, and a lot of people have talked to me in the past, like, that's such a weird career choice, if that's the case. You know, it's really forced me to get outside of my comfort zone. And so it's really helped me in a lot of avenues of my life, honestly. It's made it easier for me to communicate. You know, I can go into a pizza place now and get my pizza that I ordered. So things have changed because of that. And so I still have my nerves. I'm always going to, but I've learned how to manage that and make it that, you know, those processes no longer feel like a grind to me.
Well, with that being said, do you have a favorite player that you interview / cover on the Seahawks?
You know, I don't want to play favorites because there's a lot of guys on the team that I really like, but I will say this. Quandre Diggs is probably my favorite Seahawk to interact with, at least the ones that I've gotten to interview with. Bobby Wagner, very close second. I always appreciated Bobby Wagner for his off-field comments and his business savvy and, you know, social issues. Quandre Diggs, I just love it that he roasts me, and he roasts all the reporters. And here's the thing. I mean, I've dished back to him a few times too. And you know, I appreciate it that there's a player that, you know, you have to know what every player, you know, is personality like. And so I would say Quandre is probably, he's probably my favorite. And also just the fact, you know, the roasts also happen on social media. People see that. He does it to all kinds of reporters. And I appreciate how real he is. So, but I could say this about a lot of, you know, there's a lot of guys in the team. There's coaches and stuff that I really enjoy interviewing. And so can't complain. Again, it's a job that doesn't feel like a job.
100%. I mean, maybe next time around, just to kind of get back at him, maybe you're going to have to lift more than him in the next combine, media combine, right? That was real fun to watch.
You know, he was giving me so much flack for running a 5.5. And I think for a guy that hadn't done any sprint training for like 12 years.
That's
And
not
was
bad.
like 20 pounds heavier than my playing weight. I'll take a 5'5", but next year that combine, I'm going for an under 5. I'm
Under
already
5.
training right now. I can tell you that right now. I'm running
Oh,
sprints 2 or 3 days a week. I'm going to be ready to go next March when they have this in 2023. So,
hey, I believe it, Mr. Corbin. I hope to see you there. But before we wrap things up, Corbin, I do want to give you a chance. I know you do have the daily Locked On Seahawks podcast, and obviously you post articles consistently. So I want to give you a chance to kind of plug yourself before we wrap things up.
yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can find our stuff. It's now all Seahawks instead of Seahawk Maven. We rebranded, but Seahawks. You can go to si.com/NFL/Seahawks. That'll take you to our website, and we've got daily articles and videos on there. And Locked On Seahawks is available on all major podcast platforms and streaming 5 days a week on YouTube.
Man, hey, Corbin, this has been an honor. It has been a pleasure. One more time, ladies and gentlemen, please give him a round of applause. This is Mr. Corbin Smith of Sports Illustrated, repping the Seattle Seahawks. And this has been your host, Calvin Domingo, a.k.a. Steezy A. Smith, on another edition of On Beat, brought to you by the 32-Bit Network. Hope you all have a great day, and go Hawks.